Brothers and sisters, the last few days we've been under the tutelage of St. John of the Cross, and this great saint, mystic, and doctor of the church. Along with Teresa of Avila, as I said, they're both doctors of the church in terms of their doctors of prayer. Church is saying you could listen to them as great spiritual guides, masters of the spiritual life, who can lead us to a more profound understanding of prayer and also what God is calling us to as Christians and what Christ has promised the Christian to experience on this earth. And you know, like when we think of the moral life and the do's and don'ts of the commandments, we have to see that within a much greater context of the kind of joy and peace and the sense of God's living presence that he has for us. We do live in unique times with unique challenges. Every age there have been temptations, but I think it's safe to say that today human beings are faced with more temptations than ever before, because we have invented so many technologies, so many things that now make, entertainment and distractions infinitely more possible. And so we have to be doubly on our guard against, the distractions of our world that detract us from this kind of joy and the promise, the fulfillment of Christ's promise to his followers, that if we followed him and followed his word and his gospel and led our lives out with him into those pockets of silence and prayers he had with the apostles, then we would experience Christ in our midst and in our hearts in the most incredible way. And so this is not just my advice. This is the experience of the saints, the experience of the church. This is what the church teaches us that we ought to expect. And so I have a few quotes by Pope John Paul II and another one by another Dominican theologian just to run through. But let's just finish up some of the words by St. John of the Cross, that, St. John of the Cross is saying that, as I've said so much, that it's through suffering that is purifying us, because ultimately the cross, the trials, the discipline of following Christ at all costs is meant to transform our hearts. It's meant to stretch our hearts for an ever greater capacity to receive the presence of God, to have a much deeper experience of God already in this life. And so St. John of the Cross says that, the soul cannot enter into these treasures. In other words, the hidden infinite treasures of Christ, the spiritual taste of Jesus in the soul, of the living God in our midst. It says you cannot enter these treasures nor attain them unless it first crosses into and enters the thicket of suffering, enduring interior and exterior labors, and unless it first receives from God very many blessings in the intellect and in the senses, and has undergone long spiritual training. You see, brothers and sisters, there is more. There is more. There's so much more of the spiritual life, if but we would, and I throw myself into this as well, become really sane. In other words, see the world from the gospel, from what Christ is saying I have for you, and to embrace his call to follow him, to live that life that leads to joy, unending joy, which ultimately will flower in heaven. But already we have a foretaste of these things on earth. When the church celebrates Mass, when we go to celebrate Mass, the church gives us different prayers, and for the prayers for the saints, for if it's celebrating a saint, in the prayers of what we call the preface, I think it's something like, already they got to experience those gifts on earth of a foresign of the world to come. They're already their first fruits of eternal life here on earth. And this is what the mystical life of the church is teaching us about. That is called for everybody, not just for a few elite spiritual, athletes, but for everybody's called to this. But unfortunately, we know that the road is narrow and few enter that door. The Lord wants to put as many people on that narrow path. It is narrow, but it leads to an ever expanse of life. And so St. John goes on and says, would that men might come at last to see that it is quite impossible to reach the thicket of the riches and wisdom of God except by first entering the thicket of much suffering, in such a way that the soul finds therein its consolation and desire. The soul that longs for divine wisdom chooses first and in truth to enter the thicket of the cross. This is really very interesting. And so the gate that gives entry into these riches of his wisdom is the cross, because it is a narrow gate. While many seeks the joys that can be gained through it, it is given to few to desire to pass through it. And so, brothers and sisters, let us ask the Lord for that desire to long to be with him, to pass through the cross with him, so that we could be purified, so that we could taste the delights of heavenly love already upon this earth. And so, just a quote by Pope John Paul, he says that, he talks about the great mystical tradition of the East and the West. And he says that it shows how prayer can progress as a genuine dialogue of love to the point of rendering the person wholly possessed by the divine beloved, vibrating at the Spirit's touch, resting filially within the Father's heart. And he says, this is the lived experience of Christ's promise. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him. And he says that this journey is totally sustained by grace. Yes, it goes through painful trials, but taste the promise of Christ.